Today we will study and reflect on the groundbreaking book by WEB Dubois, Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880, in which we can see how the contrariness of WEB Dubois can advance the cause of black history. The established dogma was that the Reconstruction Era following the Civil War was a dark period in American history, where black rule bred corruption and unwanted federal interference in the governments of the Deep South. But W.E.B. Du Bois counters by claiming that the Jim Crow Redemptionist Era following Reconstruction was the dark era when blacks lost the right to vote, any semblance of due process and fair play, and that many blacks were, in effect, re-enslaved in a more brutal segregationist society, and that in contrast, the Reconstruction Era was a time of greater democracy where the civil rights and liberties of all races and classes were respected. We've already recorded a video on Black Reconstruction. We will summarize this book, but this video mainly covers the history of the historians, the history of Black Reconstruction. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in our PowerPoint script posted to SlideShare. Please, we welcome interest and questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. During his tenure as professor of sociology at Atlanta University, W.E.B. Du Bois sought to advance the cause of the Negro by scholarship as well as by activism, and his efforts had real effect, as he was published in the national press, including the Atlantic magazine, which was founded during the Civil War era, and Foreign Affairs, as we discussed in our video on the latter part of his life. During the transition period between his first stint at Atlanta University and his co-founding of the NAACP's Civil Rights Activist Organization, W.E.B. Du Bois obtained funding to attend and deliver a paper on Reconstruction at the American Historical Association. He considered it as both a personal honor and a racial challenge. David Levering Lewis, W.E.B. Du Bois's biographer, says it best. To suggest that there had been benefits to Reconstruction was equivalent to describing benefits in the aftermath of the plague. Only a few feet away from the lectern on which Du Bois arranged his speech sat Columbia University's William Archibald Dunning, high priest of the regnant dogma in the Reconstruction scholarship, founder of the Dunning School, whose successive generations of historians deplored the decade of federal intervention in the South as a tragic era of Negro misrule. And we couldn't find a picture of Professor Dunning except for a cover on this collection of essays on Reconstruction in the Dunning School of History, which includes a foreword by Eric Foner. And we may purchase this collection and do a video on this in the next year or two. Du Bois told his fellow historians, granted then that the Negroes were to some extent venal, but to a much larger extent ignorant and deceived, the real issue was whether they showed any disposition to learn better things. Du Bois, in contrast, contended that it was the federal government who failed to create and sustain the Freedmen's Bureau, which in its short existence worked to better black education, public hospitals, fair labor contracts, judicial due process, and guaranteeing black suffrage, confronting white supremacy, and sometimes the KKK Night Riders. In his presentation, W.E.B. Du Bois summarized three accomplishments of Negro rule in the Deep South during Reconstruction: democratic government, free public schools, and new social legislation. Mr. Dunning had mild praise for this paper by W.E.B. Du Bois that sought to turn Reconstruction scholarship on its head. And the paper was published in the American Historical Review in July 1910, but was virtually ignored by mainstream scholars, overwhelmingly white, until the civil rights era of the 1960s, after World War II. One minor accomplishment that Booker T. Washington had also promoted is a change in style in scholarly publications, that the word Negro should be capitalized. And this small change emphasized that Negroes should be treated with dignity like all other people. Ironically, the current holder of the Dunning History Chair at Columbia University is Eric Foner, who has advanced the thesis of Black Reconstruction by careful historical research in the newspaper articles during this time period. He has published many books on Reconstruction history, including The Second Founding, A History of the Reconstruction Amendments Abolishing Slavery, Granting Citizenship to All Males Born in the United States, guaranteeing due process to all citizens, and guaranteeing that all citizens have the right to vote. In our discussion in our video on WEB Dubois' roughly 2-decade stint as co-founder of the NAACP and editor of the NAACP Crisis magazine, which successfully helped the NAACP gain recognition as the leading civil rights activist organization, we discussed that one of the many reasons for his resignation from the NAACP, although he continued to submit important articles to the Crisis magazine, and his reemployment as professor of sociology at Atlanta University, was that he wanted to embark on a major research project, the groundbreaking book based on the ideas of his paper so many decades before, Black Reconstruction in America. And he was encouraged in this project by black leaders, including James Weldon Johnson. What cultural influences did his book, Black Reconstruction, seek to combat? One of the first public relations battles of the NAACP with W.E.B. Du Bois as editor of the Crisis magazine was the popularity of G.W. Griffith's movie, The Birth of a Nation, that glorified the Ku Klux Klan as Ivanhoe-like white knights seeking to protect the sanctity of white womanhood, rather than painting them as the brutal white supremacist Knight Rider thugs who terrorized, vandalized, and sometimes raped and murdered blacks who were trying to vote, stand up for their rights, or even just earn a decent living. This movie led to the second incarnation of the KKK. The original KKK had been driven out of existence by federal troops ordered into the South by General Grant under the civil rights legislation passed by Congress. The Birth of a Nation was both an unapologetically racist movie, shocking many even in the pre-war times in 1915, leading to many communities banning this film from their local theaters, and it was also a technologically groundbreaking film in the history of filmmaking. This movie was the longest movie of the time by a long shot, running for a full 3 hours, using revolutionary filming techniques which you can read about in Roger Ebert's review of this historical film. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote Black Reconstruction when he was becoming more interested in communism, but W.E.B. Du Bois mostly uses communist code words such as comparing the black proletariat to the white proletariat, while noting that in America there is little class cohesion along economic lines, as the white workers are just as hostile to Negroes as the more well-to-do whites. Never does W.E.B. Du Bois promote the Bolshevik idea that the lower classes should overthrow the established social order with armed violence. His is more of a gentler, kinder, kumbaya kind of communism found only in the utopian dreamlands. And now we'll summarize the book, Black Reconstruction. And in Black Reconstruction, W.E.B. Du Bois reminds us that before the Civil War, the market's value of slaves was the most valuable asset class in the country. In today's dollars, a slave was worth as much as an economy car is worth today. Slaves were treated like they were talking livestock. Most slaves were denied the ability to marry. Healthy young Negro women who were considered to be potential breeders fetched high prices on the slave auction blocks. And the chapter subheads are a good summary of the book, so we'll go through a few of those. Chapter 1, Black Worker, how black men coming over 3 centuries became both a challenge to its democracy and always an important part of its economic history and social development. Chapter 2, The White Worker, how America became the laborer's promised land, and flocking here from all the world, the white workers competed with black slaves and with growing exploitation. As a reminder, Lincoln first cut his political teeth with the Free Labor Party, which was just this concept. And Chapter 3, The Planner, how 7% of the nation ruled 5 million white people and owned 4 million black people and sought to make agriculture equal to industry through the rule of property without yielding political power or education to labor. And Chapter 5, The Coming of the Lord. And this is exactly how the blacks felt about the Civil War. How the Negro became free because the North could not win the Civil War if he remained in slavery. How arms in his hands, and the prospect of arms in 1 million more black hands, brought peace and emancipation to America. Chapter 6, Looking Backward, how the planners, having lost the war for slavery, sought to begin again where they left off in 1860, merely substituting for the individual ownership of slaves a new serfdom of black folk. Now, during the Redemption Era, the blacks were terrorized, and they were terrorized during the Reconstruction period as well. An eyewitness tells a Senate committee, some planters held back their former slaves on their plantations by brute force. Armed bands of white men patrolled the country roads to drive back the Negroes wandering about. Dead bodies of murdered Negroes were found on and near the highways and byways. Gruesome reports came from the hospitals, reports of colored men and women whose ears had been cut off, whose skulls had been broken by blows, whose bodies had been slashed by knives or lacerated with scourges. A veritable reign of terror prevailed in many parts of the South. And Du Bois continues, while all instruments of group control, police, courts, government appropriations were in the hands of whites, no power was left in Negro hands. If a white man is assaulted by a white man or a Negro, the police are at hand. But if a Negro is assaulted by a white man, the police are more apt to arrest the victim than the aggressor. If he is assaulted by another Negro, he is in most cases without redress or protection altogether. Historians have been critical of WEB Du Bois for limiting his resources to relatively easy, accessible sources such as congressional reports and convention proceedings, dissertations, and monographs, with only the occasional newspaper article. Now, these sources were sufficiently comprehensive to paint a coherent picture of the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, and he would have risked his life traveling to rural courthouses, libraries, and newspaper offices in the Deep South to consult the original sources, not to mention the fact that he did not have the research budget to enable him to do this research. After several years of research, Black Reconstruction was published in April 1935. Although the book did not sell out its initial print run of several thousand copies, it did garner many approving reviews by publications outside of the Deep South, especially the New York Hearst daily newspapers. Many historians reconsidered their views of Reconstruction, even in the Deep South. There was some denigration. The New Yorker proclaimed that the author took the odd view, in distinction to most previous writers, that the Negro is a human being. Oh heavens. Another issue that's directly related to white supremacy is the issue of lynching. Whether lynching was justified to protect the sanctity of white womanhood, or whether it was just simply a brutal murder. Publicizing false narratives that justified lynchings was the life work of another co-founder of the NAACP and brave journalist I.W. Wells. The NAACP magazine, The Crisis, included a monthly tally of lynchings so it would be continually in the public eye. There were likely over 10,000 blacks were lynched in the years after the Civil War, and lynching somewhat stopped at about the time of the Civil Rights era, the 1960s. Now, did the Dunning historians regard blacks as inherently inferior? And our biographer Lewis includes several quotes from leading Dunning School historians that suggest that they agreed with Chief Justice Taney in the infamous Dred Scott decision, which we discussed in our second founding video. Not only was the black man inherently inferior, the black man had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and blacks were considered lesser human beings. Indeed, under slavery, slaves were regarded as if they were talking livestock. We also explored this white supremacist attitude in our survey of slave autobiographies of Frederick Douglass, the first generation of black leaders, Booker T. Washington and Father Augustine Tolton, the second generation of black leaders, and W.E.B. Du Bois's Soul of Black Folk, who was born during Reconstruction and belonged to the third generation of black leaders. Dunning's Professor John Burgess in Reconstruction in the Constitution stated that a black skin means membership in a race of men which has never of itself succeeded in subjecting passion to reason. In 1910, Albert Hart in the Southern South concluded that the Negro race is inferior, and his past history in Africa and America leads to the belief that he will always be inferior. And perhaps his view is, once a slave, always a slave, and this slavishness is inheritable, ignoring the obvious intelligence shown by the black leaders we mentioned. The first three were illiterate and learned how to read and write with great effort. Also in 1910, the future President Woodrow Wilson published Division and Reunion, that interpreted the purging of Negroes from office holding in the voting rolls of the South as merely the belated result of the natural, inevitable ascendancy of whites. And Lewis has similar quotes from white historians, including the historian Frederick Jackson Turner, who saw the closing of the frontier in the 1890s as a key transition in the history of the United States, a viewpoint that downplayed the effect of the struggles of Negroes on American history. Often white historians blame the blacks for their subservient position, some claiming they should have been more enterprising under slavery. And Lewis also quotes from black historians that are more sympathetic to the arguments of W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction. The Encyclopedia Britannica invited Du Bois to submit an entry on the Negro in the United States for its 1929 edition, but his article was not included because W.E.B. Du Bois insisted that these two sentences be included, and the editor objected to them. and here they are. White historians have ascribed the faults and failures of Reconstruction to Negro ignorance and corruption. But the Negro insists that it was Negro loyalty and the Negro alone that restored the South to the Union, and established the new democracy, and instituted the public schools. So how did the economic depression of the 30s affect the views of historians? In history, like relationships, can be complicated. Some historians, such as Charles Beard in his 1944 New Basic History of the United States, who recently experienced the Great Depression, tended to interpret history from an economic viewpoint. W.E.B. Du Bois could not ignore economics. Slavery itself was the foundation of the antebellum economies of the Deep South slave states. Charles Beard may have read Black Reconstruction, but since he did not include a bibliography, we cannot tell. Charles Beard has this curious passage. Millions of Negroes, hitherto held in bondage, generally illiterate, little experienced in management if often skilled in the arts of industry without property, were now free. Most of them in the Confederate States had been loyal and helpful to their masters and mistresses during the war and had not deliberately sought their freedom. No doubt there were some kind masters. We explored some of these relationships in our slave autobiographies, and we also explored a very vivid description in our review on the Yale lectures on the Civil War. And the kinder slave owners may have imagined that their slaves would be loyal, but nearly all slaves were grateful to be freed, if for no other reason that they were free to marry and legally have a family and not work under the overseer's whip. There is some variation here in the biography of Father Augustine Tolton. Some blacks who were owned by Catholic masters were allowed to marry. Now, Beard mentions the Emancipation Proclamation only in passing, as if it were not a true turning point in the Civil War. And the painter William Aiken Walker preferred scenes of ordinary black folk in the Deep South. This looks like North Florida. And the sickly dog in the corner of the painting may represent the decrepit state of the South after the Civil War. Maybe he did read Black Reconstruction, as Charles Beard does add. There were exceptions, thousands of exceptions of slaves eager to be freed. At least 100,000 Negroes had served in the Union armies as soldiers and laborers. As the Union armies advanced in the South, other thousands of Negroes gave them aid and support in the hope of forwarding their own liberation. Now, Beard, I think, is understating the role Negroes played in the Union victory. If there were 100,000 Negro soldiers, then there were surely hundreds of thousands aiding the Union cause. Beard continues, in the South as well as the North, hundreds of Negroes, intelligent and educated, furnished some leadership for their bewildered people. And Beard also notes how the black codes were passed restricting the rights of the freedmen, which he says that Northerners saw this as an attempt to restore slavery under another name. But there were many narratives that Charles Beard chose to ignore. Although he mentions Frederick Douglass in passing, he does not mention either Booker T. Washington or W.E.B. Du Bois. He does not mention the brutality of Reconstruction and the Jim Crow Redemption Era that lasted until the 60s. There's only one footnote reference for the KKK. There's no mention of the tens of thousands of lynchings in the Deep South, and there's no mention of the total lack of due process for blacks, and no mention of how blacks lost the right to vote. Beard declines to speculate how segregation actually hurt the Southern economy. And going forward in time, how did the Nazi race policies affect the Civil Rights era? Now, historians often tell you more about themselves, the times in which they live, and the historical culture that absorbs into their pores than the history of the past civilizations they paint. And it was no accident that both the Civil Rights Movement, social justice, and the Second Vatican Council all peaked in the 60s, which was a mere 2 decades following the Second World War. This shift in historical perception meant that W.E.B. Du Bois's ideas in his book, Black Reconstruction, became the predominant historical narrative, while the Dunning School became the historical curiosity. The experiences of the horrors of fascism and totalitarianism and the millions of Jews murdered in the Holocaust, preceded by the persecutions of Jews and the Nazi race laws, affected how historians viewed the Civil War, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow Redemption eras, and there are explicit links between white supremacy and Nazism. The Nazi lawyers actually used the Jim Crow segregation laws as precedent when drafting the Nazi race laws soon after Hitler assumed power. And this political shift also occurred in public attitudes about peonage, the enslaving of poor blacks under vagrancy statutes and the brutal convict labor system in the Deep South, which was really an American system of abusive convict labor camps with high mortality rates from harsh working conditions, inadequate food and medical care, and hazardous working conditions. And this was a more brutal form of slavery than before the Civil War. And we compared Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail to Hannah Arendt's work on the banality of evil, drawn from her observations of the Israeli trial of Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucratic Nazi who administered the Nazi death camp system. And there are parallels, and Martin Luther King explicitly compares the black experience of segregation and lack of due process to the Nazi persecution and murder of millions of Jews in the Holocaust, viewing the tens of thousands of lynchings of blacks over many decades as truly an American Holocaust. And we've also cut a video on how the World War II experiences of the Catholic Church and all Christians and clergy under the fascist regimes of Europe affected the calling and the decrees of the Second Vatican Council. These decrees explicitly reject anti-Semitism, preach respect for all other religious traditions, rejects totalitarianism, and views democracy as the long-term friend of the Church, and reaffirms the Catholic Church's preferential option for the poor, supporting social justice. So what did the book Black Reconstruction achieve in America? Our biographer Lewis notes that, by far, Black Reconstruction's greatest achievement was to weave a credible historical narrative in which black people, suddenly admitted to citizenship in an environment of feral hostility, displayed admirable volition and intelligence, as well as the indolence and ignorance inherent in 3 centuries of bondage. It invested these former slaves with what later generations of historians would gravely call agency. WEB Dubois reveals how the emancipated blacks sought to improve themselves, were hungry to learn how to read, how to become educated citizens, and how black citizens, like all American citizens, deserved respect, human dignity, due process under the law, an equal chance to education, an equal chance to learn and practice a trade and earn a living wage, and the right to vote, which safeguards all other civil rights. W.E.B. Du Bois describes his view of American history. Of all that most Americans wanted, this freeing of the slaves was the last. Everything black was hideous. Everything Negroes did was wrong. If they fought for freedom, they were beasts. If they did not fight, they were born slaves. If they cowered on plantations, they loved slavery. If they scowled, they were impudent. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. We used as our primary source the biography of W.E.B. Du Bois by David Levering Lewis, and also his introduction to Black Reconstruction. We also consulted W.E.B. Du Bois's autobiography, plus we had picked up the American History book by Charles Beard, published in 1944 at some used bookstore sometime in the past decade or so, plus the many books that we consulted for the other videos we mentioned. And these are all very readable books. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.